This first image is of first image of Theodore Maiman in 1960 operating the first laser. Since then, laser has been used for different applications, starting from laser machining to entertainment to imaging, then optical tweezers, then gravitational observation, and apart from that, optics has applications like telescope. And as we can see that Hubble telescope, that is again one of the greatest tools of science of modern day. And we can see one of the images that it captured of one of the nearest galaxies. Now, coming to how light is a tool of modern science, or what are the different applications of light. So if we talk of light as a tool, there can be numerous experiments, numerous different situations where light can be used as a tool. But I would take a few of them. And what makes light a unique thing is that it can be used as a probe. Like many other things, light can be used as a probe of experiments. So you can use light to probe something, get some information out of something. Light can be used as an enabler. So it can enable someone to do an experiment. And light can be used as both. So I will take some of the experiments from these and try to put up a big picture of how light is an inevitable part of modern science. Now, let's begin with some simple experiments. So we start with the basic idea of how exactly light interacts with matter. So when we consider light to be an electromagnetic wave, so it interacts with matter, creates oscillation in the dipoles or the charge that is present there in the material, and in response, a wavelength is emitted. So if it is transmission and reflection, the case of transmission and reflection, we get the same wavelength of light with varying amplitudes depending on the material. Now this simple idea can give us techniques like shadowgraphy, Schlieren imaging, interferometry, which have been used over decades for understanding different physical phenomena. So let's begin with shadow. So what is shadow? Shadow is the simplest thing probably every one of us see. Whenever we walk in sunlight, we see a shadow. We walk at night, we see a shadow. We see anything light with something that comes in the path of light, we see shadow. So this is one of the most common manifestations of light that we all see. Still, this is a very scientifically significant tool because this can give us information about qualitatively about the shape of something that is causing a change of refractive index. So basically it can tell us about the locus of points with abrupt changes in the refractive index. So what we can say is that shadow is something that talks of change in refractive index, and this shadow itself is quantifiable. How? Let's see. This simple thing can be used for understanding the flow of fluids, change in concentration, and many such things. So what exactly, how does this happen? So we have got a source of light, we put an object, and that object casts a shadow. As simple as that. And what we can see one of these examples, that this is the image of a jet that comes out of agricultural spray. Now this we can see exactly what is the spread of it, what is the extent, and how exactly it looks. So this simple technique can give us an information, and now if we quantify this information, if we try to observe this information over time, or we do a systematic recording of this information, we can get measurable scientific quantities out of it. Shortly, I will show some of the experiments where this has been used. Next, we can think of Schlieren. What exactly is Schlieren? So, if there is a change in a quantity, or if there is a change in refractive index because of some change in some quantity, that essentially means that there is some gradient. The changes are not abrupt, right? Something changes from a particular value to another value. Maybe that changes over a very small period of time or over a very small extent of space, but still there is a change, and that change has a gradient. So how fast the change is taking place? So if we want to study that, how fast the change is taking place, then we have got Schlieren that measures the deflection of light. And deflection because of what? Deflection because of change in the physical quantity that leads to a change in refractive index, and that change the rate of change of refractive index reflects the rate of change of the physical quantity itself. So we can see in this image on the right that what is happening is there is a bubble. Suppose there is a gas bubble or a vapor bubble which has got a varying temperature starting from center to its periphery. So, so the light that is passing through different parts of the bubble will get deflected differently. And then if we can by some means measure that deflection or quantify that deflection, we can precisely predict the gradient of the temperature or the gradient of the heat transfer, such physical quantities. Now to do that, this simple schematic can help you understand. So what exactly is done is that we have got a light beam that passes through our object of interest, and we put a filter, a radial filter, which has got red at the center and maybe magenta at the end. So it's basically a Vibgyor filter where your violet is at one extreme end, that is the outer radii, and center is red. So the light that does not deflect will come out as red, and the light that gets deflected will have a different color. So basically the deflection is being quantified in terms of the color of light, and we exactly know while printing this particular filter that what is the angular deflection that can cause a particular color to show up in the photographic plate. So exactly we can see this particular experiment where a metal plate is being heated up, and this metal plate is letting a bubble to grow and then depart. So if you observe this experiment, you will see that this bubble departure leaves a trail of temperature gradient behind it, which is easily understandable by looking at this clear image. So this is, if we just observe this and if we try to find out what exactly this experiment is all about, you can see that this on the right hand side image, you can see a trail of green color or different colors. What does that tell? That tells us the direction of flow of heat, or it tells us the gradient of the temperature, which in turn can give us the heat that is flowing. If there is a high gradient, that means there is a higher amount of heat flow. If there is a lesser gradient, there is a lesser amount of heat flow. And how do we measure the gradient? We measure the gradient depending on the color. So if there is a particular color coming out, we can talk of that, okay, so this is moderate gradient, this is high gradient, this is low gradient. So if we see, this is a very simple experiment, yet giving us a lot of scientific data. Similarly, other experiment that we all know is interferometry, that has been done since long time, since the time when probably Michelson, he made up the first interferometer, the Michelson interferometer, which again is considered a marvel of science. And now if we see, if two different kind of waves, say two plane waves, they are interfering, we get one particular kind of fringe pattern. If a plane wave and a spherical wave interfere, we get a different kind of fringe pattern. If two spherical waves interfere, we again get a different kind of fringe pattern. And by looking at these fringes, the separation between them, we can quantify the change in the refractive index that causes the phase change. Because we all know that this fringing effect takes place because of the change in phase or change in refractive index. Now, let's take this example that we have got some transparent glass plate or any transparent material, quartz plate, which has got a notch somewhere that actually changes the thickness. So if there is a change in thickness, that is reflected by a change in the shape of the fringe. The fringe gets shifted, and this fringe shift gives us the measure of refractive index change. Now this might look a very simple experiment, but this has got profound implications. To show that, another example that we can see, that this is again a problem of mechanical engineering, where people do extensive study that how a sessile droplet will evaporate. If we have got a droplet, of water on a plate, and we give certain amount of heat flux, how that droplet is evaporating, what is the rate of evaporation, how is the thickness changing, how is the how is the radius of that droplet changing given a particular pressure condition or temperature condition. So we can see these are again interference patterns that are because of the thin film interferometry, and we can see that by observing these images frame by frame, we can exactly find out the rate of change of temperature or the amount of liquid that is getting evaporated at a particular instant of time, or maybe the thickness, the rate at which the thickness of that sessile droplet is varying with time. So one such experiment that I would like to show is very interesting, that has got multiple applications. The ablation, the laser ablation of materials. So laser ablation of materials is something that has got applications from material processing to laser welding to, say, it has got medical application like bursting of tumors or bursting of a malignant cell, things like that. So what happens is that a high power laser, if it is focused on a particular material, it, depending on the time, the span of the, or the time duration of the pulse, it causes uh, either evaporation and then plasma formation, or direct plasma formation, depending on what kind of laser pulse we are using. So at the end of the day, what happens is that if you are focusing a high energy laser beam on a metal target or a polymer target, it will eventually cause a formation of plasma, and that plasma would expand fast because of the high temperature and pressure gradient. The point at which the laser is striking, if I try to quantify, suppose the temperature is 1 electron volt, which means a temperature of 11,000 Kelvin. So at a point, imagine at a point on the surface, the temperature suddenly becomes 11,000 Kelvin, or maybe it's 2 electron volt, so it's 22,000 Kelvin. At such high temperatures, the plasma expands, and it expands, and in due course of expansion, it pushes the medium, so it eventually causes a shock wave, and that shock wave tells us so many things about the nature of plasma, the nature of the medium, and we can, and this thing happens over a very small period of time, over few, it ranges from the shock, the entire shock formation, that process, it starts from a few nanoseconds and extends to a few microseconds. So this can be understood by this particular image. If you see this video, so this is the explosion. So you can see that when a bomb explodes, it creates a kind of shock. So this is a slow motion recording of a explosion of a bomb. So you can see that a hemispherical shock front propagates in the medium. But on contrary, what we see here is a pretty large field of view. However, if we talk of plasma or plasma-induced shock, that's a very small region, right? We are trying to observe it over a small region. You can see a laser beam striking a metal target, and that causing a plasma. Now, if we just let the light of the laser light pass through it, we can see that there is a shock wave, a shock front that can be observed here. You can see the shock front, right? And if we let the two beams interfere, we get an interference pattern. Now, if we see, these are different distances of the propagation of shock. So you can see a clear hemispherical shock front at different distance of time, 1.5 microseconds, starting from 1.5 microsecond to 4 microsecond. Now, a simple technique of shadowgraphy can tell you about the speed of the shock, which in turn can help you find out the place in the medium or the temperature of the shock front, things like that. So now, if you look at this is the evolution of shock as we see in terms of interferogram. So you can see that interferogram, if we look at the interferogram, we can see the shock is propagating through the field of view, and this field of view is roughly 20. So you can understand that is 2 centimeters of substrate that it is covering in around 15 microseconds. So this, and exactly at the shock front, we can see an observed incident in the fixed pattern. So specifically looking at this, we can find out the amount of compression that has been caused because of this shock. Now, if we try to analyze, how do we analyze that? So we have got an interferogram. From there, we can find out the refractive index. That's again is something that we have been doing till this far. It's a simple inversion problem that we have got an interferogram. We get the phase information from there. We get the refractive index from there. And once we have the refractive index, we know that refractive index is related to the density of the medium, and it also is related to the charge. So the region where the charge is there, the refractive index will essentially be less than 1. So by analyzing that region separately using the known dispersion relation, we can find out the charge density in the plasma. So a simple interferometry experiment can give us about the kind of plasma that we are having, what is the amount of charge in the plasma, and of course how much compression it is creating in the medium. So if we look at this, the time evolution, we can find out how the shock is propagating in the medium. And that can give us about the distribution of energy in the shock, how the energy in the shock is distributed. That we can see in this case that over the time the energy is dissipating radially outward, which again is a fact of scientific information, because if we are trying to do something like pulse laser deposition or any application where we are actually causing ablation and trying to deposit something on some substrate, we need to know exactly how the plasma plume and the shock is propagating. So this one experiment can give us about information about shock velocity, shock temperature, pressure. It can tell us about spatio-temporal evolution of the energy in the shock, and it can also tell us about the effect of on the medium in the front and rear side of the shock front. So this interferometry experiment in itself, it gives a complete picture of a physical phenomenon. So that's how effective an optical experiment can be, even though it's simple. And that's why this talk, that optics is an effective tool for measurement. Now, now this was about how we use light as a tool. There are experiments where light is an enabler of experiment, like optical tweezer. So optical tweezer, as Professor Ghatak talked about in the last presentation, that optical tweezer, the man behind it was Professor Arthur Askin, who was awarded Nobel Prize in 2018, and he enabled us to handle small biological entities, small dielectric particles using the force of light. So this is one of the non-contact methods of handling small particles, which otherwise would have been difficult to handle. We can separate out particles, we can stretch DNA, we can fold DNA, we can do such things just because we have got optical tweezers. And the first paper in this regard was published in 1986, where he demonstrated the first application of optical forces. Now, so this thing in 1989, first time a cytoplasmic cell manipulation and surgery was reported. So that was the first time when optical tweezers was used for biological application. And this is one of the non-contact methods, and it has got a lot of flexibility. Since it is a light-based experiment, a light-based tool, we can change the wavelength, we can change the intensity, we can change the gradient of intensity, and we can have a precise control over the manipulation and maneuvering of the particle or the entity that we are trying to trap. So there are two kinds of particles on which we have got optical trapping working on. So me particles, the particles that have got wavelength smaller than their size. So these particles, we can understand that this is exactly how the radiation pressure thing works, that a ray passes through a particular medium, and because of the bending of the ray, certain amount of momentum transference take place. And that momentum transference causes the particle to get stabilized at a particular position. Stabilized probably would be a wrong word, because the particle would keep on having small oscillations because of the Brownian motion or the thermal fluctuations in the medium, but it would always have a tendency to get stabilized or stay at the focus. And the particles that are smaller in size, there we can understand this by the dipole field interaction. That is, the electric field of the laser, the intense electric field of the laser is causing the dipole in the dielectric particle to oscillate at the frequency of the laser, and that is causing a force of interaction between the dipole and the electric field, in turn stabilizing the particle at the focus. And this stability occurs when the gradient force, or the force that is acting in plane of the particle, is slightly higher than the force that is trying to push out the particle from the trap. And the scattering force, it depends on the intensity and the scattering cross section, and scattering cross section in turns depend on the refractive index and the wavelength. So we can see that if we are having a kind of particle, there is a trade-off between the particle size and the wavelength. So depending on the particle size, we can have different wavelengths, or depending on the refractive indices, we can choose different intensity, such that our conditions are met, and we can have a stable trap. So there are two kinds of possibilities, two kinds of traps, or two kinds of optical manipulations that usually happen. One is in the case of a light focused Gaussian beam, where the gradient force is is in a plane, and the scattering force is trying to push the particle out of the trap. It's in the direction of propagation of the electric field, or in the direction of pointing vectors. These kind of traps are used as optical stretchers, where we are trying to stretch something, or levitation trap, where two counter propagating beam can actually stabilize a particle in space. The other kind of trap is called single beam gradient optical tweezers, that are commonly used and commercially available these days. These kind of traps are made up of highly focused, tightly focused laser beam, where the gradient force has a component opposite to the scattering force. And this is where the single beam can stabilize, because we can understand that we can have a net force that is either zero, or that is trying to pull the particle inside the beam, to the inside of the beam, because being highly focused means that there is a slight displacement in the direction of the beam, there will be a change in the intensity. And since there is a gradient of intensity, there will be a gradient force acting in that direction. Now, if we look at this, the physical picture somewhat looks like this, that higher intensity simply means that the height of the depth of the trap is more. So that means once a particle gets trapped, it is difficult for the particle to come out. Whereas the gradient of intensity means how steep the slope is, how fast the intensity is changing. So this is the classical harmonic oscillator model that can tell us about the stability of the trap. And if we look at it experimentally, so we have got some parts, a laser beam, and that laser beam stabilizes the particle at the focal plane of a microscope objective. And exactly what happens at the focal plane of microscope objective? At the focal plane of microscope objective, we have got two forces working. One is the gradient force and one is the radiation pressure, and the interplay of these forces stabilizes the particle of interest at the focal point of the beam. Now this is one of the optical tweezers. So this was developed by me in 2010 when I was still teaching in Indore at SJSITS. So this, you can see here that there is this region where a particle gets trapped, where all other particles are moving, whereas one particle is stabilized in the media. So this is because that particular place, we see that there is a laser beam that is focused, and that laser beam is causing a trapping of particle at that point of time, at that particular region in space, and that stabilizes the particle. So this is a simple example of particle trapping, where these 1 micron sized particles were trapped using a laser beam. Also, now since the particle size, if the particle size decreases, the scattering force increases. Now, if that is the case, then we need to have very strong gradients. So these days, not just a single Gaussian beam is used, but people are also using different kind of tailored profiles, like a Gaussian beam which is modulated by a Hermite polynomial or a logarithm polynomial, such that we can have multiple peaks or multiple intensity variations in the same region, causing a very sharp intensity gradient, and that can actually enhance the trapping. So we can see that how the trapping forces change in case of different laser modes. If we are having a particular spatial light pattern, that can actually greatly enhance the stability of the trap as well as its capability of trapping small particles. So there are applications in the biological studies. So one of such applications that is commonly used is people do RNA and DNA stretching and folding, unfolding studies. So we can see here that if a particular DNA or RNA, if we have got two particular optical traps, and the two ends of a DNA or RNA, they are fixed with two beads, and these two traps separate from one another, we can have stretching, and when we let them come close to each other, we get a folding of the RNA, and that extension versus force gives us information about the mechanical properties and other such things. Another example here I would like to show is, this is from the tweezer made by a commercial company which makes a tweezer, that is JPK. So a red blood cell is being torn apart. So you see that there are two tweezers are holding two parts of the red blood cell, and over the time the force is being increased, and because of this increment of the force, ultimately the cell tears apart in two parts. So these kind of applications are there, and apart from these, there are plenty of other applications in biological sciences, in protein studies, where optical tweezers are used. So a light-based technology, a platform that is commonly used these days in the biological applications. Now recently there were multiple attempts where people have achieved the highest speed of any man-made object, highest rotation speed of a man-made object. This feat was achieved by the Purdue University College of Engineering, where two particles of 100 nanometers dimension, they were clubbed together in the shape of a dumbbell, and a 60 billion revolutions per minute speed was achieved. So this is the record for the highest possible rotation speed of a man-made object. Next, now, so we have seen how light can be used as a probe where we get information because of light. How light can be used as an enabler of the experiment. How can it be used as a platform for performing experiment? And now we are going to see the experiments that are commonly used and irrespective of the discipline of study, starting from engineering to science to various streams of science, that is microscopy and spectroscopy joined together. So that is called microspectroscopy. So here, light is the tool for doing experiment. It is the probe and it is also the means, because the signal that is coming out is also in form of light. So we are doing the experiment using light, and the information that comes out is also light. So here we can see the simplest experiment of laser excitation, de-excitation, that if we excite some material, we can get a fluorescence signal from that material depending on the internal band structure. It can be a fluorescence signal, it can be a photoluminescence signal, and that can give us information about the atomic structure, molecular structure, composition, and proximity. And we all know that these molecular structure and atomic structure, these are all very important parameters when it comes to the frontiers of scientific study, like drug discovery or discovery of any new material. So microspectroscopy is one of the things that has been invariably being used these days for studying the material properties and discovering new materials. So it was first designed in 1950 by Marvin Minsky, and this was the first design of the confocal microscope. And amazingly, this was discovered in 1950, but it did not find much of use till 1960s or even late 70s. The reason was that at that time there was no laser. So these experiments were performed using discharge lamp. And amazingly, after the laser was invented, then these experiments got momentum. And with the advent of digital light processing and the digital processing of image, now confocal microscopy is an inevitable, indispensable component of any biology or physics or materials research lab. Now, what is the advantage of a confocal microscope? So the advantage of confocal microscope is that we can have very specific areas imaged, very specific areas of interest with high contrast. Why that is possible? Because a confocal microscope does not allow the light coming from other parts, the parts that are not of our interest, the light coming from there, it blocks those parts. So essentially we are having only the illumination from the part, only the information from the part that is of our interest. And we can see this is done by something which is known as optical sectioning, that we scan the sample or we scan the light beam, and different regions of the sample are scanned at different instants of time. And these can all be put together and rendered in a 3D structure. And similarly, at a time we can have information if we integrate spectroscopy with this confocal microscope. So we can understand that since it is imaging at a particular region of space at a particular instant of time, it is also getting spectrum or any other such information from that particular space only. So we can have layered information, we can have information layer by layer, and that can help us, that does us a lot of favor. So what exactly it is? So if we see a regular wide field microscopy image, we can see poor contrast. On contrary, when we see a confocal microscope image, we see a very good contrast. That's because you can see the line shape function of the two sides. So when we see wide field microscopic imaging, we see that there is a spread. And when we see the same thing in case of confocal microscopy, we see it's a very narrow line shape function. That means we are having a very specific information, and the intensity is limited to a very specific region, whereas when we move from that specific region, the intensity falls to zero. So basically we are not getting background noises. Now, if we use this technique, we can actually have layer by layer information, and we can understand that if we integrate these layers with proper algorithms, we can have a 3D image or a 3D reconstruction from 2D slices. And this confocal microscope, the only limitation that one can have is the wavelength and the numerical aperture of the microscope objective. So if these parameters can be tuned, we can have confocal microscopes with different axial resolution and different depths of focus. That's why these days there are confocal microscopes that are using, in a single microscope, they are using various lasers for different kind of scan resolution and scan depth. So these are, you can see, this is again a 3 micrometer ball where different parts, different layers have been imaged. And if we fix all those images together, we can have a 3D rendering of that particular particle. So if we see, we can actually reconstruct that 3D structure of the material using these layers, and we can have different planes. So now this idea was so similar thing can be done for maybe asymmetric objects, and again the topological variations can be observed. And when this thing is integrated with something as powerful as Raman microscopy or laser induced breakdown spectroscopy, it can be of immense use, because apart from having a topological mapping, we can have an elemental or compositional mapping. So you see, a Raman spectrum in itself can give us so much information about a particular sample that is being tested. Now, if this thing is integrated with a confocal microscope, we can have this information segregated from place to place and for a very specific region, and this can be of immense importance for scientific purpose. So you can see that if we are having various layers and we are scanning these layers from point to point, we can actually generate an compositional map of the material. So this is one such example where a tablet or the pill has been scanned and the surface of the pill, and for different pharmaceutical ingredients, Raman map has been generated. Similar thing has been done for olivine, which is a mineral which consists of sulfur, magnesite, and sulfate, and we can see that within the particular olivine crystal, how are the different concentration and how are the materials distributed, that can exactly be mapped using a confocal Raman microscope. Now, similarly, this same experiment can be used for along with LIBS, which is again laser induced breakdown spectroscopy. What it does is, when again the laser interacts with matter, it creates plasma, and plasma means there are neutral atoms, there are electrons, and there are ions, and there are atoms and ions at different state. So when a plasma formation occurs, over the time the elements, they return to their native elemental state, they return to the ground states, and they, in due course, there is a wide variety of emission, a wide spectrum of emission, starting from infrared to from far UV to far infrared. And these emission lines can be used to identify the specific elements and their specific compositions. So this can be used to identify as small as 0.1% of the compositional mass of a particular material. So this has been used. These are some of the recent papers that were published till where different unknown samples were scanned using LIBS, and their compositional maps were made. So you can see that if you have got an unknown sample, you can exactly find out the local concentration variation. So starting from a technique like Raman or LIBS that used to be a technique for bulk characterization using the confocal microscopy, that has been a tool for now microscopic analysis of materials, and that has been able to give us a specific very local concentration, or that has enabled us to quantify very small quantities of materials specific in a particular region over the large area of sample. So with this, I have just shown some of the experiments. If we talk of the experiments or the methods or the equipments where light is used as one of the tools, probably an entire day of lecture will not suffice. So there are multiple other things that have not been covered, but just I have put their name, which all of them are these days used for a host of applications, scientific discoveries. They are instrumental, and these all are there because of the mostly because of the presence of laser, and because all of them use light as a tool, which not just enables us to have a better resolution but also the speed, we all know. So with that, I would say that this day when actually laser was invented was a day when the entire paradigm of scientific research or the optical experiments shifted, and we are here to commemorate that day. So this was what I actually wanted to say about that, how light has changed the way we have looked at science from the very beginning. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kaushik Choudhury, for a beautiful talk on light, a tool for modern science. Now comes to the question and answer session.
Yeah, so anybody, if you have got any questions, please feel free to ask.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions in the question chat box.
Yeah.
So question is where are the shock waves are produced, inside the plasma plumes or outside?
Okay, so that's an interesting question. Plasma plumes, when let's understand this process as a whole. So what happens is when a particular material, just a minute, I am just sharing uh, so can you see the whiteboard? Hello?
Yes.
Yeah, you can see the whiteboard.
No, sir.
Okay, just a minute. So I will share this. Yeah. So now you can see the whiteboard, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it is
So
visible.
yeah. So if there is a particular target material and laser wave is incident on that, so at some point when the laser is incident, so at that point what happens is you have got uh, shock wave, we have got immediate ionization. So that ionization causes that ionization causes formation of neutrals and electrons and ions. Now these try to so this is at this point, so there is a formation of plume which comprises of electrons, it comprises of positive ions, and it comprises of neutrals. So there are neutral particles. Now this particular point where the temperature is very high, say if it is 1 electron volt, as I said, it is somewhere close to 11,000 Kelvin. Now these things try to expand outside, and in due course of expansion they push the medium. So we know that the shock waves are generated when something is trying to move past a medium with a speed higher than the speed of sound. So this expansion speed, the speed at which this expands due to the variation of temperature and pressure, this causes a push in the medium and this causes a shock. So essentially the shock is outside the plume. At the very initial stage, say around first 50 nanoseconds of the formation of plasma, the shock is inside, but after 50 nanoseconds we always see that this shock moves past the plasma plume, and plasma plume moves at a much slower speed as compared to the shock. So essentially the observable shock that we see in the microsecond regime is always outside the plasma plume, it's not inside the plasma plume.
I hope this answer. Next question from Mr. Dinesh. So
Yeah.
he have asked 3 questions. First,
Yeah.
how does the LIGO observatory exactly work?
Okay.
And next question is, can we observe the behavior of electron using confocal spectroscopy in the double slit experiment? And last one is, if we replace the laser with plasma in LIGO machine, then what effect will we see?
So first question, I think LIGO, how it works. So LIGO, as the name suggests, it's a laser interferometric gravitational observatory. So basically LIGO is observing the gravitational waves using laser interferometry. So I would try to shed some light on it. I think Professor Ghatak, if he is there, he is the right person, but I would just give some very brief understanding of it as I know. So when gravitational waves strike a surface, so it causes extension on one particular direction and compression on the other. This is what happens in case of gravitational waves. So if it strikes Earth at a particular place, so in one direction there will be extension, and then in the perpendicular direction to that will be the contraction. So LIGO is basically a Michelson interferometer. So this is one mirror, this is another mirror, and a laser light is going to one mirror and coming to the other mirror, and we see that there is an interference pattern observed somewhere here. Now if a gravitational wave causes an extension in this side and a compression in this side, then essentially the distance between the two mirrors will change and there will be a shift in the fringes. That is the underlying principle of LIGO. However, there is much more involved engineering and science about what should be the wavelength of light, how much is the sensitivity, how do we cancel noise for such a large setup which is having arms of length of kilometers, and how are we cooling the mirrors. Those are different things, those are technical things. But the fundamental principle is this, that since we know that the gravitational waves are stress waves and they cause compression in one direction and elongation in the perpendicular direction. So if we are having a Michelson interferometer such that one arm undergoes extension, other arm undergoes compression, so basically we are changing the optical path length between the two arms, causing a phase change, and that phase change will cause a phase shift, and that phase shift will cause a shift in the fringe pattern, and that's what we observe in LIGO. What is the second question? Hello?
Second. No. Hello.
Yeah. What is the second question?
Second question is, can we observe the behavior of electron using confocal spectroscopy in the double slit experiment?
Confocal spectroscopy, that is actually microspectroscopy. It's not. So when we talk of confocal, we essentially mean that there are two focal points which are connected. That's the idea of confocal. So what exactly happens in a confocal is that the light source, from where the light is coming, one pinhole is there, and at the point where this light is focused, this is at another focal point. So this is the idea of confocal. So I don't understand exactly how confocal microscopy and double slit experiments are related, because double slit experiment, yes, we can understand the behavior of electron with double slit experiment, because that's how electron wave interference can be done. But confocal spectroscopy with electron double slit experiment, I really don't understand the question.
Okay, next move to the last question.
Yeah.
We replace the laser with plasma in LIGO machine, then what effect will be seen?
So so laser is basically light source. Plasma is not treated, nor not being used as a light source. Of course, this particular experiment that relies on one very important thing, that the coherence. So the coherence over that long distances. So first of all, the light coming out of plasma is not a coherent light. As I said, it's a broad spectrum with a spectrum, long spectrum of wavelengths. So I don't think that a broad light like that can be used for interferometric experiment, which has got this much amount of sensitivity required, that it can actually measure very small phase changes that are occurring because of the longitudinal contraction and extension of Earth. So I don't think that plasma source can be used as a source for LIGO.
Now comes to the last question for the question
Yeah.
section. So last question from Meenakshi.
Yeah.
What are the technological advantages in the term of optical devices in the sub-diffraction limit and advantage of using nanomaterial in achieving the same?
Okay, so that's an interesting question again, because super resolution microscopy is something that people are using these days invariably. So super resolution is, as the name suggests, super resolution. That means we are trying to beat the diffraction limit. We know that this is easy to understand using a picture. So if we are having a wavelength, if we are having a particle and the wavelength is smaller than the particle, so now there are multiple wavelengths, and we know that we can use this wavelength to look at this particle. But the problem arises when the particle is small and the wavelength is big. It's like, you try to understand it in this way, that if there is a speed breaker in the road like this, and you have got small tires, you can actually feel the speed breaker. But if you have got a tire so big that it actually negates the effect of these bump, the bumper is so small compared to the size of the tire, you will not be able to resolve that there are undulations on the street, right? Exactly same thing happens if there is a wavelength that is smaller than the size of the particle. So we can actually analyze that particle using that wavelength, and that is limited by the diffraction limit, that is 1.22 times lambda. So that is the diffraction limit. That means the first maxima of one should match with the first minima of the other. So this is the diffraction limit. Then two particles can be resolved. But these days, people are using near field scanning techniques like nanophotonic, the techniques of nano optics that are actually beating the diffraction limit. So one such technique is near field scanning optical microscopy, where the very specifically designed nanotips are used for imaging the surfaces. So there actually, yes, super resolution is possible, and nanotechnology is one of the important tools in achieving that super resolution, because the tips are nanostructured, which is again because of the presence of nanotechnology.
Thank you, Professor, for excellent talk. For the remaining question, we will compile and email to speaker.